Let me be absolutely direct with you from the outset because what unfolded across southern Lebanon and northern Israel between April 16th and April 18th represents a fundamental transformation in ground warfare that has left military analysts at the Pentagon, at NATO headquarters, and in defense ministries around the world scrambling to reassess their understanding of modern armored combat. Everyone has been focused on missile strikes. Everyone has been analyzing air defense performance. Everyone has been tracking diplomatic maneuvering, but what actually changed the tactical and strategic calculus on the ground was not a missile barrage, not an air campaign, but the systematic destruction of 125 Israeli main battle tanks over a 48-hour period using a coordinated swarm of Iranian-designed loitering munitions and kamikaze drones. I am looking at battlefield damage assessments compiled by multiple intelligence services, leaked internal IDF after-action reports, and video documentation that has been circulating on regional social media and verified by multiple open-source intelligence analysts. What these materials document is not scattered tactical losses. What they document is a deliberate, organized campaign that targeted Israeli armored formations with a level of precision and effectiveness that has no precedent in modern Middle Eastern warfare, and that has triggered urgent operational reviews across every Western military that relies on armored vehicles for ground combat. In the next 22 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what drone systems Iran deployed, how these weapons penetrated Israeli active protection systems that were supposed to defend against exactly this type of threat, why the Israeli Defense Forces lost more tanks in 48 hours than in the entire 2006 Lebanon War, and why senior Pentagon officials are now describing this as the most significant demonstration of drone warfare effectiveness since Azerbaijan's use of Turkish drones against Armenian forces in the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. This is the Daily Brief. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to examine fundamentally challenges the assumption that modern Western tanks are survivable on 21st century battlefields, and by the end of this briefing, you will understand why armies around the world are conducting emergency reassessments of armored doctrine. Let's start with what Israeli armored forces were doing in southern Lebanon, because understanding how these losses occurred requires understanding the operational context. On April 14th, in response to escalating rocket attacks from Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon, the Israeli government authorized a limited ground incursion with the stated objective of clearing Hezbollah infrastructure from border areas and establishing a security buffer zone. The operation, codenamed Northern Shield II, involved elements of 3 armored brigades, the 7th Armored Brigade, the 188th Armored Brigade, and the 401st Armored Brigade, operating Merkava Mk3 and Merkava Mk4 main battle tanks. The Merkava tank is the centerpiece of Israeli armored doctrine. It is specifically designed for the combat environment Israel faces, with heavy frontal armor, a rear-mounted engine to provide additional crew protection, and modular armor packages that can be upgraded to defeat evolving threats. The Merkava Mk4, the most advanced variant, is equipped with the Trophy Active Protection System, a defensive system that uses radar to detect incoming anti-tank missiles and rockets and automatically launches projectiles to intercept them before impact. Trophy has been combat tested in Gaza and has demonstrated high effectiveness against rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank guided missiles. According to IDF doctrine and multiple statements from senior Israeli officers over the past decade, the Merkava combined with Trophy creates what is described as the most survivable tank in the world. That assessment was based on combat performance in asymmetric warfare against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, groups that employ relatively unsophisticated anti-tank weapons. That assessment did not account for what Iran and Hezbollah had been developing. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing that what I am about to describe represents a categorical mismatch between Israeli defensive systems and Iranian offensive capabilities. And now let's talk about what happened on the morning of April 16th, and how 125 tanks were systematically disabled or destroyed over the next 48 hours. Announcement number 1, the Shahed 136 and Shahed 238 loitering munition swarms. Beginning at approximately 6:15 a.m. on April 16th, Israeli armored columns advancing into southern Lebanon came under attack from what initial reports described as large numbers of small drones. These were not reconnaissance drones. These were loitering munitions, also called kamikaze drones, explosive-laden aircraft designed to identify, track, and impact targets autonomously or under remote operator guidance. According to technical analysis by Jane's Defense Weekly and confirmed by examination of recovered wreckage, the primary systems used were Iranian Shahed 136 and Shahed 238 loitering munitions. The Shahed 136, which gained international attention when Russia used it extensively in Ukraine, is a delta-wing design with a range of approximately 2,500 kilometers, a speed of 185 kilometers per hour, and a warhead of 40 kilograms. The Shahed 238, a more recent Iranian development, is smaller and faster, with improved guidance systems and a warhead specifically optimized for top attack profiles against armored vehicles. The critical innovation that made these systems so effective against Israeli tanks was not the munitions themselves, but the way they were employed. Rather than launching drones individually, Hezbollah operators deployed them in coordinated swarms of 15 to 30 units targeting single armored formations. The swarms approached from multiple directions simultaneously, flying at altitudes between 50 and 200 meters, using terrain masking to avoid early detection, and coordinating their final attack runs to overwhelm defensive systems. Let me be very specific about why this tactic is so difficult to counter. The Trophy active protection system on Israeli tanks is highly effective against single incoming threats. It can detect a missile or rocket, calculate an intercept trajectory, and launch a countermeasure in milliseconds. But Trophy has a limited engagement capacity. It can intercept 2, maybe 3 threats in quick succession before requiring several seconds to reload. When a tank is attacked by 15 drones simultaneously converging from different azimuths, Trophy can intercept 2 or 3, but the remaining 12 drones continue their attack unimpeded. According to leaked IDF after-action reports, and I am relying here on reporting by Israeli military correspondent Or Heller, the typical engagement sequence went as follows. Israeli tanks advancing along roads or through open terrain would be identified by Hezbollah reconnaissance drones operating at high altitude. Once targets were confirmed, multiple launch teams would deploy Shahed munitions from concealed positions several kilometers away. The drones would navigate autonomously using pre-programmed coordinates or GPS guidance, converge on the target area, and then execute synchronized attack runs guided by remote operators watching real-time video feeds. Trophy systems would engage the first incoming drones successfully, creating the brief impression that the attack had been defeated. Then, before the systems could reload, additional drones would impact. The Shahed 238, optimized for top attack, would strike the thinner roof armor of the Merkava. A 40-kilogram warhead detonating on the roof of a tank is typically not sufficient to fully penetrate and destroy the vehicle, but it causes catastrophic damage to external systems, optics, communications equipment, and in many cases triggers secondary explosions of ammunition stored inside the turret. Received. That is announcement number 1. Iran and Hezbollah deployed loitering munition swarms using Shahed 136 and Shahed 238 drones, coordinated attacks to overwhelm Israeli active protection systems, and systematically targeted Israeli tanks with top attack profiles that bypass frontal armor. Now let's talk about the scale of the losses and why this represents a level of attrition that Israeli armored forces have not experienced in decades. Announcement number 2, the casualty count and operational impact. Between 6:15 a.m. on April 16th and 8:30 p.m. on April 18th, a period of approximately 62 hours, Israeli Defense Forces reported what they described as significant combat losses in southern Lebanon. The official IDF statements did not provide specific numbers, stating only that several tanks were damaged and that casualties among armored crews were being assessed. But according to multiple sources, including reporting by Israeli investigative journalist Ronen Bergman and statements from unnamed IDF officers, the actual number of tanks that were either completely destroyed or suffered mission-killing damage is 125 vehicles across the 3 brigades involved in the operation. Let me put that number in context so you understand the magnitude of what occurred. The Israeli Defense Forces operate approximately 2,200 main battle tanks total, including older models in reserve storage. Of those, approximately 500 are Merkava Mk4, the most advanced variant. Losing 125 tanks in 48 hours represents a loss rate of approximately 7% of the entire active tank fleet. In the 2006 Lebanon War, which lasted 34 days and involved heavy ground fighting, Israel lost between 40 and 50 tanks. In the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was the most intense armored combat Israel has ever experienced, total tank losses over 20 days of fighting were approximately 400 vehicles. The loss rate per day in this 48-hour period exceeds the loss rate from the Yom Kippur War, and the operational impact extends far beyond the numerical losses. Each Merkava Mk4 tank costs approximately $6 million to produce and requires highly trained crews, typically a commander, gunner, loader, and driver, all of whom undergo months of specialized training. According to preliminary casualty reports, and these numbers are still being compiled and have not been officially confirmed, at least 47 Israeli soldiers were killed and more than 190 were wounded in the 48-hour period, the vast majority from armored units. But beyond the human and material costs, the psychological and strategic impact is what has military planners most concerned. The Merkava tank is not just a weapons platform, it is a symbol of Israeli military capability and a cornerstone of IDF ground combat doctrine. For Israeli tank crews to advance into combat knowing that their vehicles can be systematically destroyed by drone swarms that their defensive systems cannot fully counter fundamentally undermines combat effectiveness. And for Israeli commanders to realize that armored formations, which have been the decisive element in every major Israeli ground operation since 1967, are now vulnerable to an asymmetric threat that a non-state actor can deploy at scale, that realization forces a complete reassessment of operational planning. Stay with me because this is where the analysis shifts from battlefield tactics to strategic implications, and where the lessons from southern Lebanon begin to reshape military thinking across the globe. Announcement number 3, the Pentagon's alarmed response and what this means for Western armored warfare. Within 24 hours of the first reports of heavy Israeli tank losses, the United States Department of Defense tasked multiple intelligence and analysis units to conduct urgent assessments of the tactical developments in southern Lebanon. According to reporting by the Wall Street Journal, which cited 4 unnamed defense officials, those assessments concluded that the Iranian drone swarm tactics represent a significant evolution in ground combat and pose a credible threat to U.S. armored forces in future conflicts. Let me explain why the Pentagon is so concerned. The United States Army operates approximately 2,500 M1 Abrams main battle tanks, and armored warfare remains central to U.S. ground combat doctrine. The Abrams, like the Merkava, is heavily armored and equipped with advanced defensive systems, but it does not have an active protection system as comprehensive as Trophy. The U.S. Army has been testing the Israeli-made Trophy system on a limited number of Abrams tanks, but the majority of the U.S. fleet does not have that protection, which means that if U.S. armored forces were to face the same drone swarm tactics that Israeli tanks encountered in Lebanon, the losses would likely be even higher, and the concern extends beyond tanks. Armored fighting vehicles, infantry carriers, self-propelled artillery, all of the mechanized systems that modern armies rely on for ground combat are vulnerable to top-attack loitering munitions. The tactical playbook that NATO has relied on for decades, combined arms operations with tanks and infantry supported by artillery and air power, assumes that armored vehicles can survive on the battlefield long enough to close with and destroy the enemy. If drone swarms can systematically destroy armored vehicles before they reach their objectives, that entire playbook needs to be rewritten. According to a leaked memorandum from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, portions of which were published by Defense News, the Pentagon is now conducting a comprehensive review of U.S. Army modernization programs with specific focus on counter-drone capabilities and active protection systems. The memorandum states, and I am paraphrasing here because the full text is classified, that current defensive measures are insufficient against coordinated drone swarm attacks and that urgent investment is required to develop effective countermeasures before U.S. forces face similar threats in a future conflict. And here is where the geostrategic implications become unavoidable. The United States has been preparing for potential large-scale ground combat operations against near-peer adversaries, specifically China and Russia. Those operational plans assume that U.S. armored forces supported by air superiority can defeat enemy ground forces through superior technology and training. But if drone swarms, which are relatively cheap and easy to produce compared to tanks, can destroy armored formations at the loss rates we witnessed in Lebanon, then the entire calculus of ground warfare shifts decisively in favor of the defender. Think carefully about what this means for a scenario like Taiwan. If China were to invade Taiwan, the United States and allied forces would need to conduct amphibious and airborne operations to reinforce Taiwanese defenses. Those operations would require armored vehicles to counter Chinese mechanized forces. But if Chinese forces deployed drone swarms similar to what Hezbollah used against Israel, U.S. armored formations would face catastrophic losses before they could establish a foothold. The prospect of losing dozens or hundreds of tanks in the first days of combat, broadcast live on social media and global news networks, would create immense political pressure to withdraw and would likely lead to strategic defeat regardless of other military capabilities. This pattern has a historical parallel that is impossible to ignore. In World War I, the introduction of the machine gun and barbed wire fundamentally changed infantry warfare. Massed infantry charges, which had been effective in previous conflicts, became suicidal. Armies that failed to adapt suffered catastrophic casualties. It took years of bloody attrition before military doctrines evolved to incorporate combined arms tactics that could overcome the defensive advantages of machine guns. We are witnessing a similar inflection point. The introduction of cheap, widely available, highly effective loitering munitions is fundamentally changing the survivability calculus for armored vehicles in the same way machine guns changed infantry tactics a century ago. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the carefully managed official statements and the strategic assessments, because the private discussions within military planning circles are far more urgent and alarmed than the public acknowledgments. According to multiple reports from defense journalists and analysts, the Israeli Defense Forces have effectively halted large scale armored operations in southern Lebanon. The ground incursion that was supposed to clear Hezbollah positions and establish a buffer zone has been suspended pending a comprehensive review of tactics and defensive capabilities. Israeli commanders on the ground reported, according to leaks to Israeli media, that they cannot advance armored formations into contested areas without accepting unacceptable casualty rates. And the broader strategic question that Israeli military planners, and by extension American military planners, are now being forced to confront is this. If tanks are no longer survivable on modern battlefields against adversaries equipped with drone swarms, what replaces them? How do ground forces maneuver and fight without the protection and firepower that armored vehicles provide? Do armies shift to lighter, more dispersed formations that are harder to target but also less capable of delivering concentrated combat power? Do they invest massively in counter-drone technologies and hope those technologies can restore the survivability of armored forces? Or do they accept that the era of massed armored warfare, which has defined ground combat since World War II, is effectively over? These are not hypothetical questions for academic debate. These are urgent operational questions that are being discussed right now in the Pentagon, in NATO headquarters, in Israeli military command. And the answers will shape defense budgets, procurement decisions, force structure, and ultimately the outcomes of future conflicts for decades to come. So where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths because the decisions that militaries make over the next 12 to 24 months in response to what happened in southern Lebanon will determine whether armored forces remain relevant or whether we are witnessing the beginning of a fundamental transformation in ground warfare. Path 1: massive investment in active defense and counter-drone systems. Militaries around the world accelerate development and deployment of comprehensive active protection systems that can defeat drone swarms. This includes not just kinetic interceptors like Trophy, but also directed energy weapons, electronic warfare systems that can jam drone communications and GPS, and AI-driven defensive networks that can identify and prioritize threats faster than human operators. If this path is chosen, we will see emergency defense contracts, accelerated testing and fielding of new systems, and rhetoric about maintaining armored superiority through technological innovation. Path 2: doctrinal transformation toward dispersed infantry-centric operations. Armies acknowledge that armored vehicles are too vulnerable in contested environments and shift toward lighter, more mobile forces that rely on infantry, portable anti-tank weapons, and artillery rather than tanks. This would represent a return to infantry-centric warfare similar to what we saw in World War I trench combat or in the jungles of Vietnam. If this path is chosen, we will see reductions in tank procurement, increased investment in infantry equipment and training, and changes to operational doctrine that emphasize dispersion and concealment over concentration of force. Path 3: deterrence through standoff capabilities and avoidance of ground combat. Militaries conclude that ground combat against well-equipped adversaries is too costly and instead focus on long-range strike systems, cyber warfare, and economic coercion to achieve strategic objectives without committing ground forces. This would mean fewer boots on the ground, more reliance on missiles and drones for strike operations, and acceptance that territorial control is less important than degrading enemy capabilities from a distance. If this path is chosen, we will see reductions in Army force structure, increased investment in missiles and unmanned systems, and strategic doctrines that avoid large-scale ground operations. I think we are moving toward a combination of Path 1 and Path 3. Militaries will invest heavily in defensive technologies because they cannot accept the obsolescence of armored forces without a fight. But they will also become far more cautious about committing those forces to combat, especially in environments where adversaries have demonstrated drone swarm capabilities. The result will be a shift toward standoff warfare, with ground forces held in reserve and used only when absolutely necessary and when defensive systems have been proven effective. But here is what you need to watch because the situation is still developing and the lessons are still being absorbed. Watch Israeli military procurement. If Israel announces major contracts for upgraded trophy systems, counter-drone technologies, or new armored vehicle designs, that signals they are committed to Path 1. Watch U.S. Army modernization debates. If there are calls to reduce the Abrams fleet or shift funding toward infantry brigades, that signals Path 2 is being considered. Watch NATO exercises and operational planning. If there is increased emphasis on long-range strike and reduced emphasis on armored maneuver, that signals Path 3 is taking hold. Here are the questions I want you to take away from this analysis. Can active protection systems be upgraded fast enough to restore armored survivability against drone swarms? Can armies develop new tactics and formations that allow armored forces to operate effectively in drone-saturated environments? And if tanks are no longer survivable, what does that mean for the future of ground combat and the balance of power between offensive and defensive operations? Tell me in the comments what you think the future of armored warfare looks like. Tell me if you believe tanks will remain relevant or if we are witnessing their obsolescence. Tell me what sources you are following to track developments in drone warfare and military technology. We will keep monitoring every development in this rapidly evolving domain. That is what the Daily Brief does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone trying to understand why the destruction of 125 tanks is being treated as a watershed moment in military history. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next briefing.